Welcome to the Boring Channel. Today, we will explore the exceptionally monotonous life of a 14th century horseshoe smith in extraordinary, sleep-inducing detail. Let us begin this journey into the profoundly unremarkable. He was born in the year 1327 in a small village whose name has long been forgotten. Two parents whose names no one bothered to record. This anonymity would characterize his entire existence. From his first breath, his path was predetermined, the third son of a horseshoe smith, destined to spend approximately 38,250 hours of his life, should he live to 45 years, performing the exact same series of motions with a hammer. His typical morning began in darkness. Not poetic darkness, but the ordinary, stuffy darkness of a one-room dwelling that smelled perpetually of wet wool and wood smoke. The rooster's crow was not the cheerful herald of a new day as poets might describe, but rather an irritating alarm. That meant his father would soon be nudging him with a work-hardened foot. Rising required precisely 7 minutes time needed to put on the same tunic he wore yesterday and would wear tomorrow, adjust his leather apron, and splash his face with water that was always slightly too cold. Breakfast was a solemn affair of barley porridge, the same barley porridge eaten every morning for 29 years of his life. The texture varied only between lumpy and slightly more lumpy, depending on how attentively his mother stirred the pot. On feast days, they might have a bit of salted pork mixed in, but this was rare, perhaps 17 times in his entire childhood. The walk to the forge took exactly 147 steps. He knew this because he had counted them every day since age 8, when his father first deemed him old enough to assist. The forge itself was a squat building of wattle and daub that leaned slightly to the left, a fact that bothered no one enough to fix it. The tools were arranged precisely as they had been for generations. The hammer with the chipped handle used by his grandfather, the tongs that pinched your fingers if held wrong, which he learned through exactly 23 pinched fingers between ages 9 to 12, and the anvil whose surface bore the scars of approximately 218,000 previous hammer strikes. The first task was always the same: building the fire. This required gathering exactly 14 pieces of charcoal, each about the size of his palm, arranging them in the same pyramid shape his great-grandfather had used, and blowing on the embers until they glowed sufficiently. This process took between 12 to 15 minutes, depending on wind conditions. On particularly damp mornings, it might take up to 22 minutes. During which time his father would sigh heavily exactly every 90 seconds. The first customer typically arrived around 7:30 a.m., usually Farmer Henrik's plough horse, a beast of remarkable stubbornness that required being shoed every 6 weeks like clockwork. The horse would stand with the same long-suffering expression it had worn for the past 7 years, occasionally flicking its tail in the exact same pattern. Measuring its hooves took precisely 3 minutes per foot, a task he could perform in his sleep and occasionally nearly did. The shaping of the horseshoe followed an unchanging ritual. Heat the iron to a dull red, never cherry red, as his father had admonished him 1,742 times. Hammer it into a curve, 37 strikes, typically required. Cool it in the water trough, which produced the same hissing sound every single time. and fit it to the hoof, where it would inevitably require 2 to 3 additional adjustments. The entire process for one horseshoe took between 23 to 28 minutes. Farmer Henrik's horse needed for shoes, meaning this single job would consume between 1 hour 32 minutes and 1 hour 52 minutes of his day. Lunch was at noon precisely, a thick slice of rye bread with a scraping of lard. Sometimes there would be a bit of onion, but only if his mother had bargained well at the market. He ate this in exactly 7 minutes, while sitting on the same worn stump he'd used since childhood, which had, over the years, conformed slightly to the shape of his backside. The afternoon brought more horses. The blacksmith's son from the neighboring village would bring his cart horse every 3rd Tuesday. The miller's daughter would bring her pony every 2nd Friday after the feast of St. Eligius. Each animal required the exact same process, with only minor variations in hoof size that made absolutely no difference to the overall tedium of the work. Injuries occurred with predictable regularity. A burn on the left forearm every 6 to 8 weeks, say smashed thumbnail approximately every for months, say cinder in the eye every 13 to 15 weeks. Medical treatment consisted of swearing loudly 7 to 10 utterances, rinsing with whatever liquid was nearest, usually dirty forge water, wrapping with whatever cloth was cleanest, usually not very clean, continuing to work. As the years passed, he developed calluses in exactly 14 locations on his hands, each with its own distinctive pattern that he could have described in exhaustive detail had anyone ever asked. No one did. His back ached in the same spot every evening. His knees creaked with the same 2 sounds when standing up. The forge's income was steady in its mediocrity. 1 penny per horseshoe, 3 pence for specialty work, which occurred every 17 days on average, an occasional chicken or sack of grain in lieu of payment at age 24. He married the daughter of the local cooper, a match arranged by their fathers that involved exactly 3 conversations before the wedding. Their marriage was one of quiet tolerance, marked by 7 distinct routines that never varied year to year. She bore him 4 children, 2 of whom survived to adulthood, statistically average for the period. His death, when it came at age 47, was as unremarkable as his life, a fever that lasted 9 days before carrying him off. The village record noted simply, "The smith is dead." His tools passed to his eldest son, who would go on to perform the exact same tasks, with the exact same motions, for another 38 years. The forge still stands today, though no one remembers. His name, asterisk, if you were to visit the site now, you would find nothing particularly remarkable, just a patch of uneventful ground where the building once stood. Perhaps a few scattered nails oxidized beyond recognition, their original purpose faded into obscurity. The anvil, if it still exists, has likely been repurposed by some later generation, hammered into something new. Its previous life as a tool for shaping horseshoes long forgotten. The charcoal dust has washed away with centuries of rain, the soot long since absorbed into the earth. No plaques mark the spot. No local legends speak of the smith who worked there. His existence has been reduced to the faintest of echoes in time, a whisper lost beneath the weight of years. The rhythm of his work, once so vital to the daily life of the village, has been replaced by other rhythms. The hum of machinery, the click of keyboards, the rush of cars passing by on roads that did not exist in his time. No one now remembers how many strikes of the hammer it took to shape a single horseshoe. No one recalls the precise angle at which he held the tongs when turning hot iron, the calluses on his hands, the ache in his back, the way his breath fogged. In the cold morning air, as he blew life into the embers, all of it has dissolved into the same indifferent silence that claims all ordinary lives in the end. Even the horses he shod left no lasting trace. Their hoofprints vanished with the next rainfall. Their names, if they had any, were never recorded. The animals themselves lived, worked, grew old, and died, just as he did. Their bones long since turned to dust beneath pastures or parking lots. The shoes he crafted for them rusted away, were buried, or were melted down and reforged into something else entirely. Not a single one survives in a museum. No historian has ever written a paper on his particular method of filing down rough edges. His craftsmanship, though undoubtedly competent, was never extraordinary enough to be remembered. And so the world moved on. New smiths came and went, each performing nearly identical tasks with only the slightest variations in technique. Villages became towns, then cities. Horses were replaced by machines. The need for hand-forged horseshoes dwindled, then disappeared entirely. The knowledge he possessed, the exact temperature at which iron bends most easily, the way to calm a skittish mare during fitting, the trick to making a shoe that wouldn't loosen after a week of ploughing, became obsolete, then forgotten, perhaps. On some quiet afternoon, a descendant of his walks past the site of the old forge without realizing it. Maybe they pause, feeling some faint, inexplicable tug of familiarity. A half-remembered story from a grandparent about an ancestor who worked with iron. But the moment passes. They check their phone. They continue on their way. The past does not reach out to them. And that is how history treats most of us. Not with dramatic endings or lasting monuments, but with quiet erasure. The smith lived, he worked, he died. The world barely noticed. The forge is gone. His name is gone. But for these few minutes, as you listen to this recounting of his unremarkable life, he exists again, just a little. And soon, when this recording ends, he will fade back into the silence, just as we all will in time. Life in the village moved like the turning of a mill wheel's low, inevitable and powered by routines so deeply worn they felt like the natural order of the world. The smith and his wife were not unique in their monotony. Every soul in the settlement lived a life of repetition, their days measured in familiar aches and muted satisfactions. The shape of their fierce fear was a constant, but not the sharp, thrilling fear of beasts or bandits. No, their dread was duller low, unshakable awareness that disaster was always one poor harvest away. Hunger was the oldest and most patient enemy. A bad summer meant thin soups come winter. A late frost could shrivel the barley, leaving the village to chew on bark bread until spring. Every meal was eaten with the unspoken knowledge that next year's might be scarcer. Sickness came like fog creeping, indifferent and inescapable. A cough in autumn could be a death rattle by Christmas. Childbirth was a gamble. Mothers and infants slipped away so often that villagers crossed themselves at the sight of a pregnant belly. The smith's wife had lost 2 children before they could walk. No one remarked on it. Such was life. The Lord's taxman arrived each Michaelmas, his ledger thick with numbers that never favoured the poor. A harsh winter might kill sheep, but the tax on wool stayed the same. The villagers paid in grain, in chickens, in grudging silence. To protest was to invite the bailiff's whip. The fleeting joy's happiness, when it came, was smaller momentary warmth in a life of chill. The first bite of an autumn apple, tart and crisp, stolen from the orchard behind the church. Fruit was rare, sweetness rarer still. The smith's wife would hoard hers, slicing it into slivers to make the pleasure last. A shared laugh at the tavern, where ale watery though it was loosened tongues. The miller might tell the same joke he'd told for 20 years, but laughter came easily when the harvest was good. The rare afternoon of idleness, when the sun was high and the forge cool. The smith might sit by the river, letting his feet dangle in the water like a boy's, for an hour. He was not a tradesman, just a man, watching minnows dart between the reeds. The church bells, on Easter morning, ringing clean and bright over fields still brown with winter. For one day, even the poorest villager could pretend the world was kind. The heaviest burdensome pains never lightened. A child's fever could burn through a family's hope. The smith and his wife had buried their youngest in the churchyard, under a mound of earth so small it barely cast a shadow. They marked the spot with a pebble the only stone they could spare. The unrelenting labour wore bodies into early graves. The smith's hands were knotted with arthritis by 40. His wife's spine curved like a bow from hauling water. Pain was as much a part of them as their own breath. The certainty of oblivion. No one in the village expected to be remembered. They would become names in a parish register, then dust, then nothing. The world would not note their passing. The quiet triumphs, and yet they persisted. The smith's pride in a perfectly fitted shoe, though no customer ever praised him for it. The wife's secret pleasure in mending a tear so neatly it vanished. The way the village gathered when a barn needed raising. Working without pay because that was what neighbors did. The scent of fresh baked bread on a frosty morning. A fleeting comfort, but enough asterisk, asterisk, ... And so, as the embers of this story fade to ash, we leave the smith and his wife to their unremarkable lives lives much like our own in their quiet struggles and fleeting comforts. They asked for no monuments. They expected no applause. They simply lived, as people always have, between the shadows of fear and the small, warm light of ordinary joy. Tonight, may you drift into sleep as they drifted through their days without fuss, without fanfare, cradled by the gentle weight of the mundane. If this tedious tale of forgotten lives has lulled you into drowsiness, do consider subscribing to the Boring channel. Like this video if you barely managed to stay awake, and leave a comment telling us which part finally sent you into dreams. Was it the 14th century tax policies, the description of calloused hands, or perhaps the thrilling debate about rye? bread density. Asterisk, asterisk, good night. Sleep, as the villagers slept deeply, without memory, and ready to wake tomorrow to the same unchanging rhythm of life. And what of the smith's wife? Her name, like her husband's, has been lost. She was likely the daughter of another laborer, perhaps the cooper, or the thatcher, or the man who repaired fishing nets when the river was high. Her marriage was not a choice, but an arrangement, a quiet transaction between families who needed each other's hands more than their hearts. Her mornings began even earlier than her husband's, while he stirred the forge's embers. She was already kneading dough, her palms pressing into the same dense rye bread she made every morning, the texture never changing, only the size of the loaf adjusting slightly depending on how much grain they could spare. The fire in the hearth was smaller than the forge's, but it demanded just as much attention to hot, and the bread would scorch. Too cool, and it would emerge sticky and unchewable. She knew the balance by touch, not thought. Breakfast was served in silence. The children ate quickly, their eyes still heavy with sleep. Her husband barely looked up from his bowl. There was no conversation, only the sound of chewing, the scrape of spoons, and the knowledge that the day's labor had already begun. Once the men left for the forge, her real work started. There was always something to mend a torn tunic, a cracked wooden bowl, a leak in the thatch that let in the rain. Her hands moved through these tasks without hurry, without pause. She was not fast, but she was thorough. A stitch was never dropped. A patch was never half fixed. The work was dull, but it was hers. If it was washing day, and it always seemed to be washing day, she hauled water from the well, bucket by bucket, until her shoulders ached. The clothes were beaten against rocks, scrubbed with lye soap that left her fingers raw, then hung to dry on the same line her mother had used. The linens were never truly white, just varying shades of grey-brown, but they were clean enough. No one in the village had whiter laundry, and no one cared to compare. Midday brought cookinga, pot of thin stew, thickened with whatever scraps were left from last night's meal, a handful of barley, a few wilted greens, a bone if they were. Lucky, she stirred without enthusiasm. The flavors never changed, the pot never emptied completely. There was always another meal to make, another fire to tend. In the afternoons, she might spin wool if there was any. The spindle turned in her fingers, the fibers twisting into thread at a pace so slow it was almost imperceptible. A single skein could take weeks. No one rushed her, no one praised her for finishing. The wool simply needed to be spun, and so she spun it. Sometimes, if the light was good, she would sit outside and peel vegetables for supper, her knife moving in the same shallow arcs, the peels piling at her feet in unbroken curls. A neighbor might nod to her in passing. They might exchange a few words about the weather, or the price of grain, or the health of someone's child. The conversations never lasted long. There was always work waiting. By evening her hands were stiff, her back sore. She served supper without comment, ate without tasting, and lay down to sleep without dreaming. The next day, she did it all again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Continue with additional layers of monotony, such as the exact number of stitches required to darn a sock, the way her fingertips grew rough from scrubbing pots, the unchanging expression on her face as she watched the village girls giggle, knowing she too had once giggled long ago, the sound of her husband's snores, which never varied in pitch or rhythm, until the full runtime is reached.